just want to say it's wonderful to see all of you out there. And for those of you who come every Sunday, I just want to say how wonderful it is to sit up there and be able to see that glorious stained glass window that is right up there behind the choir. It is so peaceful and it's beautiful. So there, you have that. Would you pray with me just for a moment? Oh God, may the words of my mouth and the thoughts of all our hearts be pleasing in your sight. Amen. I don't know if I'm doing anything or if that's else. Just turn it off. Okay. I love Barbara, by the way. She's here today. I want to start with a little joke, because I've always been told that sometimes when you're in a new place and you don't know the congregation, it's always a good idea to start off with maybe something a little bit funny. So this joke all of a sudden popped up on my Facebook a couple of days ago, and it was shared with me by a fellow priest who is in Georgia, who got it from one of her friends, who got it from an Episcopal site. So it's gone through several layers to get to me. A priest dies and is waiting in line at the pearly gates. Ahead of him is a guy who is dressed like he'd been on a Hawaiian vacation. He had sunglasses, he had a loud shirt, he had a leather jacket, he had gold chains, and he had jeans. And St. Peter addresses this cool guy, and he says, "Who are you, that I may know whether or not to admit you to the kingdom of heaven?" The guy replies, "I'm Jack, retired airline pilot from Houston." St. Peter consults his list. He smiles and says to the pilot, "Take this silken robe and golden staff and enter the kingdom." The pilot goes into heaven with his robe and staff. Next, it's the priest's turn. Peter consults his list, and he says, "And who are you?" And he says, "I am Father Bob, pastor of St. Mary's Cathedral for the past 43 years. And St. Peter consults his list. Then he says to the priest, "Take this cotton robe and wooden staff and enter the kingdom." "Just a minute," says the good father. "That man was a pilot, and he gets a silken robe and golden staff, and I only get cotton and wood. How can this be?" And Peter says to him, "Up here, we go by results. When you preached, people slept. When he flew, people prayed." So take that as you will, but I hope it doesn't just fall down like this on me today, so I'll try to keep you awake. Did you listen really well to the reading in the Gospel of Jesus' parable this morning? Because I want to ask you something. I want to ask you to do something. Just think for a moment about this question. The parable of the laborers in the vineyard is about what? What it is about. This isn't a Sunday school class, so I'm not going to be able to converse with you about your answers, and you don't need to answer out loud. Just think about what you heard and what stands out to you. In other words, if this were a play, In which part would you feel more comfortable? Would you be the landowner, the laborers who worked all day long, or the ones who were chosen last? Just think about it for a moment. Over the years, biblical scholars have sorted out Jesus' parables and put them into categories. And many believe this parable falls into the category of one that jars you. It causes us to stop in our tracks for a moment. And we have to say, wait, what? They both got paid the same? The one who worked all day and the ones who just worked for a couple of hours? Suddenly, there's a sensation of cognitive dissonance. Something is not matching up to what we expect, what we have been taught, or maybe we have forgotten. The reading today starts just like a regular day in Palestine, people going to work, those hanging out looking for work, and then there's a landowner who has a vineyard with grapes that are ready to pick. So he went early in the morning to the place where the workers were congregated to be hired, and he hired some at the usual daily wage. At 9, he found out he needed more, so he went and hired more, saying he would pay them whatever was right. He does the same at noon, again at 3, and again at 5. And the ones who were standing around at 5, he asked them, why? Why were you still standing here? And he said, because no one has hired them. So he says, well, you go too, off to the vineyard. Now, we know nothing about the workers or their family situations, only that they were standing in the marketplace looking for work. And we don't know the total number of those workers who actually went and showed up. And we don't know how many grapes there were, but apparently the vineyard was loaded because he had to go back and get more and more and more workers. But it seems just like a regular day, nothing different. It was just a vineyard owner hiring laborers. They worked all day, and at the end of the day, the landowner tells the manager, go pay the workers, beginning with the ones who started last. The 5 p.m. workers. And as each worker received their pay, the ones who had begun at 6 a.m. noticed their pay was the what? Same as those who had started at 5. The 5 p.m.ers got the same pay as the ones who went out at 6. And that's where it all starts. That's where the wait a minute, something isn't right here begins. What's happening, they say, the ones who started at 6, we've been here at 6 o'clock in the morning. We have sweated all day, we have pulled grapes all day. We were the first. They have just been here for 2 hours, and they got paid the same as us. And the grumbling and the complaining among the 6 a.m. workers increases, which forces finally the landowner to make an appearance to the group. And he tells them, I hear you, but take what belongs to you and go. Am I not free to do what I want with what I have? Or, and for my mind, it's a big or, are you envious because I am so generous? Now, if I were there, and I still do think this, their answer should have been yes. That's what's going on here. Envy. They all received the same wage. Each one of them had been hired for work. Were they happy about that? Probably so. It was food for the family for the day and maybe even into the next, until they found out the 5 o'clockers received the same pay as they did. Now, I'm sure the problem was not so much what they received, but in observing that others were getting more than they deserved. We hear this common cry a lot. It's not fair. It is not fair. More work should mean more pay, right? The generosity of God bothers us, not so much when we are the recipients, but when others are. I've been a musician most of my life, and I've spent years singing in community choruses. And sometimes envy can pop up its ugly head when it comes to the time when the music director has to point his finger and says, "You are the one I have chosen to sing the solo. It's the one that you think you should get." So you take a deep breath and you go to the person and you say, "How wonderful, how great it is that you were given the solo. You deserve it. You will be so good." Really? Or underneath, do you think that solo should be mine? I was the one who showed up to every rehearsal, got special lessons. I even invested in the chorus. But this other person gets the recognition and that special place. And when we think we don't have a problem with that in the church, that may not be the case. We're not immune from envious thoughts either. For instance, just think about it for a minute. How did that person get to be senior warden after being here only a year? I've been a faithful member, coming to every meeting diligently for 3 years, and I know much more about this church than he or she does. Well, I don't think that is fair. Do you? Another way goes, why did certain groups get all the attention? Why do they get all the funding when others are ignored? And so it goes. You can sit there and think of a million other situations. We are very uncomfortable when others receive more than we think they should. There is an Archbishop of Constantinople whose name was St. John Chrysostom, and he was known for his eloquence in preaching and public speaking. And after his death, he was given the name of Chrysostomus, which means golden mouth. He was so good. And he said this: "As a moth gnaws a garment, so does envy consume a person." As a moth gnaws a garment, so does envy consume a person. This moth that consumes bits and pieces all along the way. If we as individuals can't see the moth, or if we overlook it in ourselves, not only will our lives be miserable, but that little moth can affect the life of our families and those communities to which we belong. Our hearts begin to close so that we're not able to receive and rejoice in the blessings that we already have or will receive. We won't be able also to rejoice and give thanks to God for the blessings others receive, especially if it's more than what we think they deserve. So I think, how am I? are we envious of the priority and generosity that others receive? I don't think this parable is telling us today that laborers shouldn't demand a just wage, or that we shouldn't call corporations and others out for their unfair practices. But I think this parable is about us, our hearts being envious when we have enough, when we have what's fair, and yet are envious of those who receive the generosity in the face of not having had the opportunity to do more. My friends, God's love is generous. It's overwhelming, it's extravagant, and it's for all. Think about it as Christians. We believe radical love sent Jesus into our world to show us and experience with us a new way of living, a life of radical generosity. He suffered, yes, he did, a lot, and was buried, but he was raised from the dead, which in my mind was the most radical expression of God's love, no matter how you may interpret that event. No, we look around and see that life in general is not fair. In fact, in many ways, the world just sucks. But there is more than fairness available. God's radical generosity, the acceptance of God's radical love and grace in our lives, and accept the call to us to share that generosity with all. And I need it. We need it, individually and as a beloved community. The world certainly needs God's awesome, extravagant, generous, and gracious love. So let us not allow the moth to eat through our garments and our hearts. In just a little bit, we'll move to the Lord's table, just as the Israelites centuries ago moved to the manna from heaven from a generous God. So let us move with hope, with love, and above all, with praise and thanksgiving, with our hearts wide open to receive and accept all that extravagant, generous love that God has for us. And even for those we don't think who deserve it, God's radical love is there for all. Amen.